we'll be looking at a poem titled In Memory of W.B. Yeats, written by the Anglo-American poet W.H. Auden. This is a poem prescribed in the drama and poetry module of the paper From Modernism to the Present for the second semester MA students of MA English students of Kerala University. Shall we begin? W.H. Auden. It is appropriate for us to begin with perhaps a discussion of modernism, because that is the period in which the poem is written, and the rest of the drama and poetry that we do is also located in this area that we call modernism. This is a very broad-based title. This is a very broad-based phenomenon, and it is one of the most influential periods of literature, art, and science. You can appreciate when I call it a very broad-based phenomenon, because it is something that not only affected literature, but the arts as a whole, and science in general as well. It was a movement started in 1914 as a reaction to the First World War, and it spanned the period between the world wars. That's the First World War and the Second World War. And it marks a definite separation from the optimistic Victorian morality, and it is a response to a general social breakdown. You can see that the period which preceded this period was one of industrialization, all right, but it was a period of more optimism, and a period markedly one that had not yet, and so it hadn't begun thinking about social breakdown, and that is what happens in the age of modernism. It is also an age that rejects the optimism of the 19th century, and it presents a deeply pessimistic picture of a disillusioned culture, despair, apathy, confusion, and the authors of this period raised all the great questions of life, questions that arise out of confusion about the indecisiveness. The questions were raised, but as you can see that in literature or in the arts, or perhaps even in science, there were no answers offered, at least by the poets, there were no answers offered. This can also be referred to as a radical shift in literature styles after World War I. After the First World War came to an end, you find a complete paradigm shift, a complete change in tone and texture in the literature that was written. It also was created on a feeling of lost community and civilization. And it created a series of paradoxes and contradictions. The movement often referred to by society as a lost generation. I can explain this by saying that society saw the writers and the artists as complementary to a generation that had lost its direction, a generation that had lost its energy, and that was wondering how to redefine itself. So, a term that is often used in modernism is this, the lost generation. We move on to modernist poetry. If we have, defined the broad-based term modernism, we need to look at what modernist poetry is, because we said that it was something that affected not just literature, but that which affected arts and science as well. Now, if you look at poetry specifically, because we are doing a poem and we are talking about a poet who was very significant for the 20th century, you can see that this poetry, in keeping with the spirit of modernism, was totally against Victorian and Romantic poetry. That spirit of optimism which marked Victorian and Romantic poetry is absent here. And why? That is indeed because of the disappearance of religious faith. So, the poet writing in the modern age is writing in a godless world. And in discussing his style, one may find that a regular meter is discarded. If poetry was a compressed art which depended on a metrical pattern and style, this principle of regular meter is discarded by the modern poet. And you often don't find a regular rhyme scheme either in modernist poetry, and you find a juxtaposition of ideas. To explain the term juxtaposition, you could say that ideas are drawn from different disciplines, from different ages, from different cultures, and what is not normally seen together is put together. In other words, it's a superimposition. You find a fragmentation happening, and you also find a recombination happening in the business of juxtaposition of ideas. You find modern poets indulging in free verse, and free verse is nothing but verse that is not bound by a metrical pattern. It can have irregular lines. It can do away with rhyme scheme, and hence it has a character of its own. And what keeps it unified as poetry, as verse, is the fact that it has an internal unity, that it has a flow of thought that is unique, that is poetry in spite of the fact that it is free verse. You also have a heavy use of irony, not that irony was being used for the first time. This is a poetic device that has been used by poets from time immemorial. But, the modern poets actually used very pointed irony, and irony, is deliberate. It works against the expectations of the reader. It often says things or means things that is not implied in the words of the lines that are written. So irony is something that is important and defining for a modernist poet. There is also a stress on the use of precise visual images and unadorned, concise language. Everyday words are preferred over flowery, sentimental language. Okay, so this is how they, make a break with Victorian and Romantic poetry. Nothing flowery, nothing sentimental. You have the least of, adornments, and if you have images, they better be very visual. You heard about images and Ezra Pound, that images should be stark, they should be striking, they should make a point when they are used in poetry. So concise language and precision is very important as far as a modernist poet is concerned. Now we look at William Butler Yeats because he's the focus of our poem, the poem that we are looking at. And William Butler Yeats was a leading poet, and he introduced a directness of tone even while reviving the drama of myths. You know that he was an Irish poet, and Irish myths and mythology mattered a lot to him. And his poems are actually known for their lyricism. But what makes him a modern poet is the fact that he introduced an idiom that was direct, that had a sense of modernity in it. We look at Auden as a modern poet. Auden is our poet, and in every way, he is in keeping with the spirit of modernism. You find that his poems reflect the essence of modernism, thematically and structurally. He's modern in concept, in imagery, and in versification. He experimented with free verse. He experimented with blank verse, the ballad meter. I have, specified these three terms because these three terms are important for the poem that we're going to do. You will find a demonstration of these three verses in the poem that we're going to do. So he used different kinds of meter and versification. And what was very special about Auden and a team of poets who were collectively called the Pylon Poets is the fact that they had social concerns. They were involved with this, with what was going, the social changes around them, especially in the context of war. Auden surveys different social, political, and economic upheavals caused by world wars. And this becomes a subject of his poetry. He not only wrote poems, he wrote plays, and there were prose essays that he wrote as well. Now, in his poems, you would find the extreme brutality and violence of war depicted. Look at a poem like The Shield of Achilles, where he uses a term at the end of the poem, the last two lines of the poem, iron-hearted man slaying Achilles, who would not live long. He's reviving, the myth of Achilles as a symbol, as an image for the modern man, is extremely brutal and extremely violent. And in being that, he brings about his own end, his own nemesis. And that is being predicted in the line, who would not live long. Now, better to look at the poem that we are going to do. And in that very poem, you find, a suggestion of the extreme brutality and violence of war. Look at this expression. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. We will look at these lines in detail when we read the whole poem. But just to explain briefly, the nightmare of the dark actually refers to the political times that Auden is looking at in the poem. You know, the time when all European nations are looking at each other with suspicion, getting ready for a war, and there are political leaders who are, igniting this. They are they are addressed by Auden as the dogs of Europe barking. Now, Auden, as a poet, is also a comment on modern people who have lost their love and sympathy towards each other, as you could find in a poem like Musée de Beaux Arts, which is also a revival of a Greek myth. But then he talks about the indifference and apathy of modern man in that poem too. We move on to W.H. Auden as a poet. Some general facts about Auden and the focus of his poem. Auden was a poet, playwright, and critic. You can see from the picture that I've selected for you for my slide that he's a man in his middle age. If you Google for photographs of Auden, you will find some very handsome ones of his youth, and you might find some very haggard ones of his old age. This is one that is in between. You can see his dates. He was born in 1907 in New York, and he later became an American citizen, died in 1973. In memory of W.B. Yeats is Auden's tribute to Yeats and is regarded as one of the most memorable elegies on the death of a public figure. You can see that the elegy is, not a genre that is unknown to the English readers. The Victorians had used this genre very prolifically. You find Matthew Arnold's verses, you find Tennyson's In Memoriam, and those poems preceding what what Auden had written. Now, this is a tribute to Yeats, a man of the 20th century, perhaps the pioneer of modern poetry. And so, a look at Yeats's life is also important as far as this poem is concerned. Yeats was born in Ireland in 1856, and he embraced poetry very early in life. He was a celebrated poet very early in his life. He never abandoned the traditional verse format of English poetry, but embraced some of the tenets of modernism. As I said earlier, that he was tradition bound in many ways, in his versification, in his thought, in his attachment to Irish mythology and Irish nationalism. He was also politically active. Whether he was politically correct or not is a question for us to answer. And often deeply, he also evinces intense and fervent exhortation. He's easily considered one of the most important 20th century poets. And Auden recognizes at that time. You can see a subtle admiration for Yeats, for his versification, for the lyricism, for the symbolism of his poetry as you read the lines of this elegy, as you read the lines of this tribute to Yeats. Now we look at the focus of our poem, which is none other than Yeats. So take a look at the theme. It's an elegy for a celebrated poet, okay? A poet that needs no introduction. So an elegy is only fitting. It is a meditation on the role and place of poetry in the modern world. Okay, so in keeping with the spirit of elegies, even in the past, where the poet begins with a specific theme and then goes on to discuss things that are more philosophical, that are more worldly, that has an implication for the rest of humanity too. You have a poem which begins with the discussion of the death of Yeats, but begins to talk about poetry, Yeats's profession. What is poetry for? This is one of the questions that is raised as a theme in the poem. Can it make anything happen? This is another question which is being asked by the poet. Is poetry important? Should poetry be read? Can it make anything happen? Now he follows it up with the next question, which is actually an argument. If you don't have a question to the question, answer to the question, can it make anything happen? Then the next argument, which is not merely a quibble, which is actually, is should it make anything happen? Is it important for poetry to be answering questions? Is it important for poetry to be taking part in the life of action? These are themes that are brought up in the poem. We move on to the style of the poem. As I said earlier, this is a very well-known genre, the elegy that Auden is experimenting with. But also remember, this is a modern poem and it's no elegy of the Victorian age. So the first thing that is most striking about the poem is that it reverses the traditional style of an elegy. By doing what? By focusing on the insensitivity of the world and the desolation of the modern man and the modern mind. Okay, so this is the theme that becomes, an alteration of the style of the elegy, because they shouldn't be making its way into a typical elegy, but it does, and that is where Auden brings about a change in style. He, in fact, admits the weaknesses of the poet while praising his poetic achievement too. Okay, in a traditional elegy, you might even find that nature is celebrating, and not celebrating, nature is joining in the spirit of mourning, in the melancholic strain, which is supposed to be the dominant theme of an elegy. Okay. This poem does not take on that garb, it does not take on that spirit. In fact, there are moments in the poem which focuses on the weaknesses of the poet, but ends up in the end, finally, by praising his poetic achievement. So that is a new style altogether. It's an inversion of the elegiac style. You also have the ironic tone, which is characteristic of Auden and of many other modern poets too. There are metaphors which are very striking. And by striking metaphors, I mean metaphors that consciously deviate from what is conventional. Okay? You have this term called absolute metaphors, meaning, you bring together elements, you bring together a comparison between things or items that are apparently very unlike each other, that have no similarities, at least obviously, and yet a metaphor is worked upon, something like what the metaphysicals did. The metaphysicals did in the form of their conceits. Okay, here the modern poet, Auden, indulges in what you call striking metaphors. It is meant to shake you into awareness. It is meant to sort of disturb you, bring about a sense of alarm, and you find that happening in this poem too. As far as his style is concerned, there is a conscious metrical experimentation in keeping with the changing cadences. From my initial discussion from the previous slides, I had told you that this poem, within the poem, there is an experimentation in three different styles. You have the verse libre, or the free verse, you have the blank verse, and finally you have the ballad meter, which is the third part of the poem. Okay, so you can see how metrical experimentation divided into three parts. In free verse, as I already told you, and this is the part where the concept or the theme is open, and it is introduced in third person voice, as you have in many of the poems that observe or describe nature poems, for example. Okay, where things are described as it is seen in a third person voice. So in lines that are irregular in what is called free verse, you find the concept being introduced in the poem. The second part of the poem is a direct address to Yeats. In other words, it's an apostrophe. You have a second person usage, and that is a blank verse part. You have longer lines. We are familiar with blank verse, right from the Elizabethan times. We see how this is so close to the English speaking rhythm, and so it is good to express thoughts which are long, contemplative, which are serious. Okay, so that blank verse is being indulged in the second part of the poem, where you have longer pentameter lines. It's just a single stanza of 10 lines. It has some para-rhymes, by para-rhymes being half rhymes, and a concluding full rhyme. You just see, the dexterous facility of the writer in the way he experiments with verse in this poem. In the third part of the poem, you have regular quatrains. It's like a ballad of trochaic tetrameter. Now, trochee, is, one unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Okay, now this is not exactly speaking. Iambic is more natural to speech. Trochaic would make something very formal. It would make something very declamatory. Okay, that effect that the regular quatrains in the third part of the poem has in this poem. It has a rhyme scheme. It has a very controlled, it has a very impressive rhyme scheme. It is rhymed A, B, B, and it has an incantatory effect. It is evocative like a song and deliberately formal. The lines thus become a tribute to poetry in keeping with its message that the poet provides the unconstraining voice and can persuade us to rejoice in our existence. This is almost the message, the winding up, the wrapping up statement of the poem, that the role of the poet is to provide that unconstraining voice, quote unquote. It's taken from the poem, the last part of the poem. So the poem, in being divided into three parts and thus experimenting with three different types of versification, it ultimately satisfies the elegiac pattern. So though we said that it's a subversion of the elegy, though we said that it is, a deviation from the elegy in some ways, in the last instance, it satisfies the elegiac pattern in moving from something specific to something wider and something that is of fundamental concern with humanity. We move on with the discussion. This is the second slide on our discussion of the poem. So we look in considerable detail at part one. Part one begins by discussing the death of Yeats and the dead of winter. Yeats did die in January after all. The month of January, the English month of January with frozen brooks and snow all over. Snow makes it difficult to make out public statues. And mercury dips in the thermometer, which means temperatures are low. These are things that are described, very much like in a speech in the first part of the poem, in free verse, as we said before. And an observation is made that Ireland, however, went on as usual, even as Yeats lay ill and died. Now, this is a definite inversion of the elegiac style, because, not just a pastoral elegy, any elegy that you look at would have pathetic fallacy working in it, meaning the rest of nature is also celebrating, not celebrating, I'm sorry, I use that word twice now. It's not celebrating, it's mourning. Mourning the dead person. Okay, but here the poet makes a pointed observation that nothing changes in Ireland. Ireland went on as usual, even as Yeats lay ill and died. So Yeats's death was kept from his poems. That is, the poetry Yeats wrote remained unaltered by the fact that now he has died. Okay, now this is a statement in itself, because the poet says that the man Yeats has died, but what he has left behind is a legacy, and those poems will be kept from his death. Okay, so even if Yeats has died, he will be outlived by his poems. In the third stanza, we find a very beautiful line which says Yeats became his admirers. Okay, it's a very open line, which does not need more metaphor than this. It allows you to interpret the importance of Yeats to his admirers. Yeats, in dying and leaving the legacy of his poems behind, became his admirers. He became whatever his readers and fans decided he was, and the broader point being made here is about the immortality of poems. They survive or don't survive depending on who reads them and how those readers read them. I think there's a very serious statement being made here in this first part of the poem, where the poet says that, once the poet is dead and once the poems have reached the target, everything depends on the target audience. Everything depends on the nature of the audience that receives a poem. Okay, so, the poem would survive or not survive depending on who reads them and how those readers read them. Now, this is the fate of poetry in general. So Yeats's poems would be scattered into the lands of unfamiliar affections. Please read into the quotation marks. They are taken from the poem. Auden here prefigures one of the most influential ideas of 20th century literary criticism. You must have heard of the terms intentional fallacy or the death of the author, put forward by Roland Barthes, so many decades after, Auden writes this poem. But he's prefiguring this critical statement where the critics in later years make a statement that the work of an author does not belong to him. Okay, so to find biographical details or to read intentions into the lines of a poet is quite irrelevant. It is the reader, it is the receiver who decides what the importance of a poem, a text is. This modern idea, this postmodern idea was already, was a foreboding, was already seen, was already commented on by Auden in his poem. So Auden is suggesting that the worth and meaning of a writer lie with the reader rather than the author. Look at the words taken from the poem. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. The metaphor is taken from, funnily enough, from eating, from digestion, that the words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Now, the first section is concluded by acknowledging that the world will go on tomorrow, but a few thousand will think of the day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. Okay, this is modernism. You see a classical downplaying of the importance of Yeats' death. It is not as though the whole world is going to turn upside down because Yeats died. Rather, it is a moment when a few thousand around Ireland, around England, and around the world will think of as a very important day, will think of as a day when they did something slightly unusual. And hence you find you refusing to indulge in sentimental public mourning. We move on with the discussion to part 2 of the poem. You find a stylistic, dramatic turn here, okay? Because small stanza of a single stanza of 10 lines, and you find a use of para rhymes and then and even a full rhyme, the ending couplet, ending in south and mouth. When we read the poem, we'll look at this in detail, okay? Now, why I said this is a dramatic turn is, as you go on to read further, you will find he begins, Auden begins to turn away from Yeats in particular and moves to poetry in general. And look at these lines. These have become, lines often quoted in different contexts, lines that have become lines to remember. Poetry makes nothing happen. This is an admission of poetry's limitation as a tool for social and political change. Okay, the poet is almost confessing that poetry is insignificant. Poetry makes nothing happen. Indeed, Auden is once supposed to have said in an interview that his poetry didn't help save a single Jew who was murdered in the Holocaust, though he was witness to the Holocaust, though he wrote many poems about the Holocaust. Now, as you move on, there is a complex and engaging argument, even in these 10 lines, that is developed from the previous line. Ireland has her madness and her weather still. The previous line is, Ireland hurt you, mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. The fact that Yeats was an Irish nationalist, and it is Irish politics that, made him a very poignant poet, okay? And Auden comments that Ireland has her madness and her weather still. Okay, it's a very slighting statement if you want to see it that way, but he's actually making a very plain, stating a very plain fact about a biographical detail in Yeats's life, that the poetry that he wrote did not actually change the weather of Ireland. Poetry cannot make anything that it cannot make any change that is that significant. Okay. But then this is also an argument. This also sets every reader thinking. Okay, that is why the counter question, which I have written, after that dotted line. But who in his right mind would expect poetry to change the weather? Is it hence a cry of despair and powerlessness? Is the poet crying in despair out of a sense of powerlessness? Or is it the affirmation of the argument that poetry survives in a whole host of places? It indeed is, because this word is taken from the poet. This is the statement that the poet is making, that poetry ultimately survives. It survives where? In a whole host of places, not maybe everywhere, but in some places. In fact, a whole host of places. Now, part 2 answers the question about what poetry is, although it doesn't make so, this is a, summing up of part 2. If you're seeking an answer to what poetry is and what its role is, well, although it doesn't make anything happen, it is itself a way of happening taken from the poem. Not something that makes history, but a part of history and hence a part of life. So poetry is incapable of making history, but poetry survives. Poetry becomes a part of history. It is a part of history and hence a part of life. We move on with the discussion and we come to the last part of the poem, part 3. This is the final section. It has regular quatrains, a trochaic tetrameter, rhymed A, and it evokes the song. It is formal, it is incantatory, like a chant. Okay? So that is supposed to be, the clinching lines of the poem that pays the actual tribute to Yeats in the final part of the poem. And the poet, speaks in the omniscient voice again. Remember that in the second part, he was actually addressing Yeats as you. It was an apostrophe. You were silly like any of us. This is how he referred to Yeats in the second part. In the third part, remember, it's supposed to be a tribute in toto and has that formal effect. So he takes on the omniscient voice again, and he surmises the dead Yeats as the Irish vessel emptied of its treasures. Okay, he has lived his life. He came into the shore and he emptied his vessel of all its treasures, and now he's gone into the deep ocean. He also concludes part 3 by imagining Yeats as the inspired poet who must persuade us to rejoice and heal us with the fountain of his work. These are all, expressions and words taken from the poem, standing for poets in general and Yeats in particular. What is a poet's duty? What is a poet's role? To persuade us to rejoice, to provide us with that fountain of healing. In the final couplet, Auden is seen exhorting Yeats and all other poets to teach the free man, the living, to praise and to celebrate the short time allotted to us. Okay? The short time allotted to us signified in the lines, the prison of his days. Okay? In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. This is how, the poem ends. Okay? In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. To turn the curse is a reference very obviously to the time of war, okay, into a vineyard. You have, biblical resonances here, okay. The curse could also be a reference to the fall of man, and a vineyard also taken from the Psalms in the Bible, meant to be, a sign of hope, meant to be a sign of prosperity. To turn the deserts of the heart, standing for human distress, into a healing fountain. The poet, a poet like Yeats, despite all odds, can teach the free man how to praise. Teach the free man how to praise. Very important line from the poem. And that stands for the fundamental spark of existence that survives in one's poetry. How poetry survives. Now, in conclusion, this is what we could say about the poem, that in the last analysis, it is a very powerful poem, not just about Yeats, but about all poets whose work can teach us how to praise. These final words of Auden's poem are fittingly enough inscribed on the poet's own memorial stone in the Poet's Corner in Westminster Abbey. Okay, so you can see how significant the poem we just did is, because these lines, in the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise, is engraved on the poet's memorial stone in the Poet's Corner in Westminster Abbey. Throughout the poem, this is, one statement that you can make about the poem, the whole poem, how the spirit of modernism is kept, maintained in the poem. That throughout the poem, there's a taut restraint that prevents the poem from spilling over into sentimentality. At the bottom of the slide, I have, taken a few pictures from, the Google websites, which are clear enough, which are images from World War I, and they're all, scenes of military action, of, fighting, of, warfare, and that is clearly the background of the poem, though it is supposed to be an elegy at the death of Yeats. Shall we give the whole poem a reading? Because the poem is for the year, and it is in this reading of the poem that you must realize the versification, the modernism, the spirit that the spirit of Audenism that Auden is trying to imbue into an elegy in memory of W.B. Yeats. He disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports were almost deserted, and the snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agreed. The day of his death was a dark, cool day. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forest. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quays. By morning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his bones. But for him it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and groomers. The provinces of his body revolted, the squares of his mind were empty, silence invaded the suburbs, the current of his feeling failed, and he became his admirers. Now he scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections, to find his happiness in another kind of wood, and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floor of the bourse, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. What instruments we have agree. The day of his death was a dark, cold day. You were silly like us. Your gift survived it all. The parish of rich women, physical decay, yourself. Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. For poetry makes nothing happen. It survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper. Flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy briefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives, a way of happening, a mouth. Earth receive an honoured guest, William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. Time that is intolerant of the brave and innocent, and indifferent in a week to a beautiful physique, worships language and forgives everyone by whom it lives, pardons cowardice, conceit, lays its honours at their feet. Time that with this strange excuse pardon Kipling and his views, and will pardon Paul Crowther, pardons him for writing well. In the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. Intellectual disgrace stares from every human face, and the sea of pity lie locked and frozen in each eye. Follow poet, follow right to the bottom of the night, with your unconstraining voice, till persuade us to rejoice. Make a farming of a verse, with a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. That's the end of the poem. Now I have some books quoted here for further reference. All of them help you in the understanding of the social context of modernism, modern literature. Of these books that you find here, perhaps the most familiar one for us is the third one, anthology written for 20th century poet. It's called 20th Century Verse, an Anglo-American anthology. And the introduction written by Professor C.T. Thomas to this anthology is a very comprehensive one on modernism, and the different poets, the various phases of 20th century. And Auden finds his rightful place in this anthology with 6 poems dedicated to him. Yeats finds his rightful place in this anthology with 5 poems dedicated to him. The other books are Malcolm Bradbury's The Social Context of Modern English Literature, Michael Levenson's The Cambridge Companion to Modernism, David Perkins' A History of Modern Poetry, Modernism and Art. There are a whole lot of books that you can refer to, which is prescribed in the syllabus in Kerala University, but these were books that I had access to, and so I had just quoted them here. So that was the end of my presentation on the poem. I leave it to you now. I had a very good time introducing a poem of my liking and introducing the extraordinary literary phenomenon called W.H. Auden to you. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed putting it together.
Yeah, there is a question from Bobbin Kurian.
Okay.
In some lines, it seems that that Auden slips from elegy to parody, like in the line, "Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry." Please explain.
Let the Irish vessel lie emptied of its poetry. I cannot quite understand why the student sees parody there, but maybe, because I emphasize so much on the striking and absolute nature of metaphors in modern poetry, you probably find it a well-worn metaphor that, Yeats is being compared to a vessel, an Irish vessel. But otherwise, there is no suggestion of parody there. A parody is a work in which you are trying to slight, you are trying to, belittle the theme that you present by imitating something that was of that had a greater recognition, that enjoyed a better reputation. But that doesn't happen in these lines. It's just that he's using the metaphor of an Irish vessel. Irish because he was Irish and he was, ardently involved with the Irish nationalist movement. But he was not only for Ireland; he was for the whole world. He was, arguably one of the greatest poets of 20th century, and hence, referring to him as Irish vessel is just giving recognition to his nationalism, his nationality, and at the same time recognizing the fact that he was a great poet who carried a whole treasure house of poetry in that vessel in which he traveled through the ocean onto the shores where the people could read his poems. And then finally he receded into the ocean, disappeared into the dark in his death, as is stated earlier in the poem. So there is no parody there. It is actually, lines that are very formal and very impressive. And as I said earlier, there is, there is an incantatory effect. And this is deliberately kept formal because the poet wants to sum up Yeats' achievement in these lines of the poem. Is that enough? Have I satisfied his question?
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Are there any?
No other questions have come up. Could you please tell the important questions that can come for the examination from this?
You may probably be asked an essay on how, Auden's elegy deviates from the conventional elegy. Okay, and so you would have to list out a number of points that comprise a conventional elegy, starting from maybe Milton's Lycidas, comparing with Tennyson's In Memoriam or Arnold's Thyrsis. How different his elegy is from the Victorian elegies. First, by his strategy of inversion. How there is no pathetic fallacy, how there is no, mourning nostalgia for Yeats in the poem. Rather, there are a lot of facts that are stated. In fact, Yeats is even referred to, as in direct terms. Okay, you were silly just like any one of us. But then, time always forgives people who have a dexterity for language. Time is always very forgiving to people who are gifted. And the fact that you were gifted makes you what you are, and undoubtedly you are a great poet. This is a statement that is being made thematically in the poem. But, the elegiac method and the elegiac pattern is, is subverted in the poem, is deviated from in the poem. So this is one standard question that is often asked. Okay, how is this a different elegy? Is this a standard elegy? And what are the points that comprise, Auden's different elegy? What makes In Memory of W.B. Yeats different? So you would have to talk about the poem in general, about the significance of the poem, about the singularity of the manner in which an elegy is written out in memory of W.B. Yeats. That's one question. Now, for short questions, you have lines that are asked year after year, and it's mostly from the third part where he talks about the significance of the poet. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to praise. You might just be asked to annotate, and you have to talk about how the poet's role is about, finding a space, teaching people to, appreciate and celebrate life, to make a rhapsody out of life, even out of tragic situations. This is one role that he foresees for the poet. Now, other significant lines in the poem, you have this poem where I told you, there's a line which talks about the words of the living are modified, the words of the dead are modified in the guts of the living. Did you find that line? This is also often asked for annotation. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. Okay, so there is great critical significance in these lines, as I discussed in my presentation. He's almost, prefiguring later critics like Roland Barthes, okay, who talk about the death of the author, or the idea of intentional fallacy, where the author is not important, rather it is a reader who is important. Okay, all authors are subject to this distortion. Once the work has been written and has been passed on to an audience, it becomes a privilege of the audience to interpret it however he or she likes it, from the cultural context that he or she is placed. So the words of the dying man, the words of a dead man, are modified in the guts of the living. Here again, you can talk about the singularity of the metaphor, that it is very colloquial, it is taken from everyday life, and that's in keeping with the spirit of modernism. Okay, you're comparing poetry to food, food which is meant for consumption. Poetry too is meant for consumption, and it is a consumer who decides how, what is to be made of the food he consumes, the poetry he reads. These are some of the questions that I can think of. You could be asked to annotate just any line, but then remember that the lines are thick with meaning. You have ample scope to answer any of these lines for annotation.
Okay, ma'am. There are some other questions. Nandu Krishna
Okay.
has asked whether the indifference shown by the nature to the death of the great poet is synonymous to the attitude of the then political situation to life.
Very much. Actually, the first few lines of the poem describe, the winter, the English winter. And that indeed was a reality of Yeats's death. He died in January, the 29th of the month of January. So it must have been really cold. So, the description of nature being very cold and dark is physically correct on the one side, but moving on figuratively, it also speaks of a Europe that is building up into a world of hate and suspicion. A war is building up, and all the political leaders are busy, intoxicating their subjects with ideas of hate. And there are the living nations waiting to be born, some sequestered from sequestered meaning separated from each other. So this stands for a Europe that is divided. This stands for a Europe which is disintegrated. So any idea of oneness and unity that existed or in the Victorian times or before the war is soon beginning to fade. This is the beginning of a war, and that is being suggested in the commentary on Europeans in these lines.
Okay, ma'am. Another question is from Mekha NS. The question is, how would you explain the lines, poetry makes nothing happen?
As I said in my explanation, it might seem a little antithetical, it might seem a little disappointing for a poet to say poetry makes nothing happen. But remember, Auden was a left-wing idealist in the 1930s when he was writing poetry. He believed in a world of action, and he perhaps, wanted poetry to make a significant change in a society that was so ridden with, prejudices and hatred. Uh, but it did not. It does not happen. It did not happen in the instance of Yeats. It did not happen in his own case, as I told you by quoting from an interview in which he said that I wrote so many poems, but all the poems that I wrote made no difference to even the life of one Jew who was murdered in the Holocaust. Okay, so poetry in that sense does not make anything happen. By referring to Yeats specifically, he says that, look, it is because of the madness in Ireland, it is because of the Irish rebellion that you became a poet and you wanted Ireland to become free. But Ireland became free anyway. It is not because of the Irish Republican Army that Ireland became free. It is not because of Yeats's poetry that Ireland became free. So, in a very political sense of the term, Auden is convinced that poetry cannot change the world. It cannot make anything happen. And yet, Auden does not negativize poetry. He does not write poetry off because he says poetry is a way of surviving. It is like the mouth of a river. It makes things, it just happens. It has to be there. It is a part of history.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
The,
Uh, Another student, Arun Prakashias, has asked, could you please explain the conclusion once more?
the whole of the conclusion? Do you want me to go back to that slide?
Uh,
Okay. Slide. Okay. In the conclusion, I'm just making one or two final statements about the poem. On the whole, you have got an understanding of the poem, its spirit, its style, the theme of the death of Yeats, but not merely the theme of the death of Yeats. It is about the politics of Europe. It is about the significance of poetry, etc., etc. But my conclusion just says that in the last instance, this is a powerful poem, is it not? It's a powerful poem because it has so many things that are thought upon. It has so many, it contemplates all these issues, and above all, the most important issue of poetry, which is what we are dealing with. And it is not just about Yeats, it is about how to praise. Okay, so I think I have indulged in some rhyme there myself. It's not just about Yeats, it's about poetry, it's about poets. It is about how poets have a role in providing happiness to the world by making people praise, by not making people, cryptic, by not making people without conviction, rather filling them with ideas of joy, by providing them with joy that would make them people of conviction. This is the role for poets that he envisages in the poem. So, the final words of the poem, though it would seem as though, he's deviating from the elegiac pattern by, at times belittling Yeats's politics, in the end, it is a great finale. It is a great, praise for poets. Okay. And because this line, how to praise, a poet's role is how to praise, not just how to praise, but to teach humanity how to praise. And what about humanity? That they all live in their, cells, in the prison of their cells. And the poet's role is to bring them out of the prison into a liberal world, to make them think about, the liberal spirit of the human mind. This is what he means by saying that the role of the poet is to teach, humanity, or to teach the imprisoned man how to praise. And this is what makes it a powerful poem. And I was just making a statement that, the concluding as most, striking aspect of the poem is that he praises the poet in a way that has not been done by other poets. And the other significant feature of the poem is that it is very constrained. It is not a gushing, elegy. It does not, diminish into sentimentality. We don't like sentimentality as modern people. We don't like melodrama. So he takes extra caution to see that his poem does not, fall into sentimentality. That is what I mean by spilling into sentimentality. So these are the two aspects that can be spoken of as, in conclusion about the poem. That it's a powerful poem for making a statement about poets, about their significance. Okay, that they may not make everything happen in the world, but it is the fact that poetry survives in this world that makes poetry significant. And the second thing, that the poet has written an elegy without following the elegiac conventions, without being sentimental, without being gushing, without being sad in that sense of the term. He finds a sort of solution, he finds a role, he finds a way out for the poet at the end of the poem. This is the conclusion. Does that satisfy you?
Ma'am, one last question from Jishina Gobinath. It's about the political reference of the poem.
Okay.
That's a question.
Okay. I think I already mentioned that the politics of Europe is very much mentioned in the first part of the poem. Okay, where he says that in the nightmare of the dark, all the dogs of Europe bark, and the living nations wait, each sequestered in its hate. In fact, the reference to the dogs of Europe is a reference to all the political leaders of the different European countries, who were raking up a war, who were raking up ideas of suspicions in the minds of people, and Europe, which was still then somewhat united by the idea of religious unity, perhaps, okay, was falling apart. And this, idea of disintegration, this idea of distrust, suspicion, and imminent violence is suggested now and then in the poem. That is a European politics which is referred to in the poem. The beginning of a war, the First World War.
Wonderful session.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thanks to all participants.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for you too. Thank you, students. Thank you, all of you.